wife shouldn't have dug that hole, Jim.
What the season finale, Revelations Part 2. But did we get the revelations we wanted? We're about to talk about it, everything that happened in this episode, breaking it down for you guys, what it all really means and what everyone else missed in season 3, episode 10. This episode first started off very slow and it had me worried, but about after a certain point in this episode, we finally got some back-to-back action, pure excitement. A bunch of things happened. We also got some reveals, and I think what I believe, we got some of the best scenes in the show in almost all of the seasons so far. Starting off strong, we need to talk about Sara. Sara is about that action, but now Boyd actually does harm Elgin, but we see that Sara has to come in and she's the one who's going to sacrifice her soul in order to get the answers they want. That is intentional writing. That's an intentional way to pivot this, because as we're seeing throughout the show, and as we get that big, my favorite scene of the show, most likely reveal later on,
Knowledge comes with cost.
I wanted to briefly mention as well that I've discovered quite a few details about Sara and what potentially is her past that will explain a lot more about her choices as a character and what her character arc is. I'm going to save that for a completely separate video, but Sara is right. The town is specifically targeting the most vulnerable and targeting them in ways that it knows is going to work. And she is no exception. These choices we're watching her make are happening for a reason. So that'll be a whole separate video for me. But let's focus on season 3, episode 10. And now with everyone knowing that Elgin put Fatima in the root cellar, we get to move along to one of the biggest reveals of the entire season, of the entire show, and of this specific episode, which is what Fatima gives birth to and who the monsters truly are. As some of you guys know, I predicted for us that Fatima truly was pregnant, and that nonetheless, Fatima giving birth to Smiley, and Smiley basically being reincarnated and brought back into Fromville, and us finding out that you cannot kill these monsters was a pretty cool reveal regardless. But now we know what the monsters truly are. The monsters are the parents of the original children who were sacrificed. They are the original settlers of 1506 who saw already a magical pocket dimension before the children were sacrificed. That is something we have to establish now in this show, is that there was some type of entity and some type of force already here when the original people got here before they sacrificed their children. That is why the children were sacrificed. They were sacrificed in exchange for eternal life. The question is why? What would make all of these people think that eternal life was more important than their children? I'm interested to see how they explain that part. Now, obviously, this did not go how they expected. Like we see in season 1, when the monster says, "I did not choose to be this way." When you play with dark magic and you play with these entities, there's always a cost, there's always a trick. And I believed all of these parents were tricked into thinking that they would just get real eternal life. And instead, they got eternal life in the form of becoming monsters who could only come out at night. That was their exchange. That was their sacrifice that they did not know was coming. They were the first trick. They were the first game. This is something we see as a trope with anything that involves making a contract with some sort of entity in exchange for something using magic. There's usually a trick to it, even in the lightest sense of, for example, when Cinderella wanted to go to the ball and she was given the dress, but the dress ended at midnight. Or darker examples like we see in Harry Potter with the tale of the 3 brothers who all sacrificed for something that they wanted with the entity of death. And in the end, they all died in exchange for it. This is a trope we see happen a lot, and this is what From and the writers are playing at when it comes to these original parents who sacrificed their children for eternal life, but instead were tricked and were probably not knowing that eternal life meant at the cost of becoming monsters who could only come out at night and feed off of other humans and other people. And therefore, this means that the original people of the town, which I believe were in Fromville pre-1506, were the original test. They were the original game, which is something we get confirmed from the boy in white, that it all starts with the children. So going back to my landmark theory, which I still believe is true, that 1506 is where it all started, and that was the year the children were actually sacrificed. Which brings me back to the cave paintings in the cave. This is telling us the original story, which I believe most of us could put two and two together. But basically, the original people that we now see as monsters today came to Fromville, which already existed, and encountered this entity that was already here. And this entity put them through a test. The test was if they would take eternal life in exchange for their children's sacrifice. And that's what they did. And now they are cursed to forever live as monsters, which was the trick the entity pulled on them to become these monsters who can only come out at night. Now this curse itself continues a cycle where every couple years people have to try to overcome this game that this entity loves to play. And if you lose, it just continues on. It's a continuous generational curse. However, we're watching the iteration of the cycle where we believe these people will finally end this curse. And finally, now Angkhooey being remembered, although a lot of people were looking for what Angkhooey could mean compared to a bunch of other existing languages, the closest actual interpretation of Angkhooey is actually the lost language of Native Americans, which means to go beyond, go further, which is in some weird ways a synonym for remember. So I wonder if that's where they got Angkhooey from. But other than that, Angkhooey just seems to be a made up word. So it's just a made up word. There's nothing else to it. They just used it to make up a word and say that remember, and that was going to be the payoff. But then we get the biggest shock of the entire show. So first we get a cameo from Julie, who time travels back into time, and we see her with this bob wig. I don't know, the wig is throwing me off. I think she should have cut her hair for this scene, but it is what it is. And she comes from the past, and she's clearly trying to get Jim to run. She's trying to save her father. This ties back to how Ethan and her talked about how Julie is a story walker. She can go back into the past and witness different chapters that have already happened in this story, but she cannot change them, at least not yet. But right now we can see that she can at least influence them. We wonder if she can change them. We wonder if they're going to go with the trope that we've seen before of people going back in time and trying to change things, and it only still happening just in a different way. Or it actually does something worse and changes something else. We'll see what happens. We'll see how this pays off. We'll see what they do in the next couple of seasons. But that's out more information and seek out more tools to help the people in town, that we have a sacrifice at the end of it, that something always comes with a cost. And this might be the biggest cost we have yet, as the man in yellow goes on to say, I tried to warn you, your wife shouldn't have dug that hole, Jim. And he goes on to get rid of Jim. Jim was no longer be with us anymore. And this was the craziest scene to me. This is probably the best scene I've seen in the entire show so far, in my opinion. Now we know who was on the radio talking to Jim, who was potentially also playing with the music boxes, and who also might be the voices on the phone pretending to be Thomas. However, I'm not convinced of that one, but he's at least the voice that's been on the radio. He is one of, in my opinion, the bigger bads, which we'll talk about later on in this video. All right, honorable mentions, details that I found that everyone else missed that might mean nothing and might mean everything. Who radios the same way Martin is actually the entity that's behind the Cicadas and the Chosen Three and the music box. But that specific detail stood out to me, and there's some details a lot of people missed about Martin in his original scenes that I'm going to make a separate video on, so that you guys can be on the same page that Martin is not who he seems to be. Now let's rewind to the very first scene of the entire episode, which is us looking at this map that Boyd has created that is very clearly on a rendezvous box. We know that next to the police station is Boyd's trailer that has the rendezvous symbol on it as well. So that is probably where it came from. But the fact that they're bringing up this place again stands out to me, and that the map is on this box again also stands out to me. And this map looks different than all the other maps we've seen of the town. Now, this is something I'm going to have to go back and make a separate video on and decipher every single map we have seen in from so far. But every time I see a map, I feel like it looks way different. Obviously, the maps are different sizes. They're of different parts of the town. But this map in particularly makes all the streets and the turns look different than some of the maps we have seen previously of Frumville. And even some of the maps of Frumville we've seen in the cover art and the art that's been displayed on the show. So I want to compare and contrast all of it and potentially maybe even catch some things that might be telling us more about Frumville, because all these maps are different and all these maps include different details of From. Now, I want to talk about the picture that the entity gives Boyd of his house, the retirement house that him and his family were on their way to before they saw the tree. He makes an important detail to say, yes, that's the house, but there is no boat. As we know, Abby got Boyd a boat when they were on their way to the retirement house, and it was as a surprise for Boyd. So what does this mean? Why is there no boat in the picture? Well, it says a lot about what the town actually does and doesn't know. The town actually does not know everything, and it seems to only know things that have been brought up to it at some point in the town. Again, it's hard to understand how the entity would not know exactly about the boat, because there's no way to confirm that Boyd has never brought up the boat in the town itself and talked about it out loud. But I would go ahead and assume that that's what that means, is that the entity only knows what you give it. The entity only knows what you talk about in the town out loud, which is something that has been displayed throughout all of the seasons prior, where we've seen Boyd mention worms or monsters, and then he goes on to get worms. We've seen Kenny mentioned how he doesn't want to bury another body and then ends up having to bury his father. He also mentions that he doesn't want to watch someone else lose both their parents and then ends up losing both his parents. We see so many instances of people bringing things up that then go on to happen in the town, and the entity in the town uses against them. So I believe that was our first hard indication that that's what's happening in the show. The entity only knows so much, and it's only using what you allow it to have. That everything the entity is feeding off of has to be said out loud. I don't know what you guys think about that one, but let me know what you guys think about that as well. Now we need to talk about Eloise, because now with all of this reincarnation nonsense and with people wanting Eloise to be reincarnated, unfortunately, Eloise herself at this point, in my opinion, is not someone who should be reincarnated, because she is not one of the original residents who sacrificed her children. She was a child. So again, now that we know this, it opens up for us to understand that Eloise probably just ended up surviving that cycle that Victor survived as well. I, like many other people, thought that Eloise made it to the faraway tree, that she found Miranda and made it to the faraway tree and went through the faraway tree. However, I don't believe that's the case anymore. Through seeing Tabitha's visions of the past and seeing that Miranda was just killed by Smiley by the faraway tree, but there was no Eloise in sight, I believe that Eloise actually never found her mother when she left the root cellar, and this was set up by Victor's dialogue in the last episode. He mentioned how Eloise was just so good at hide and seek and he could never find her. We know that people can survive these monsters from hiding, so I wonder if Eloise ended up finding some other place in Frumville to hide and ended up somewhere else, maybe trapped by a different entity, but is somehow still alive and still inside of Frumville. We see in this episode that Victor mentions where he buried his mother and where he buried what he believes is Eloise. I don't think it's Eloise. I think he mistook somebody else for Eloise and buried them instead, and that Eloise is still alive. Now, the plot hole that develops because Fatima gave birth to Smiley, other than the fact that that's just really strange, and then also taking their tongue, which is something that we know is central to predators who take out the most important parts of the flesh of this person. But then we've seen them develop later on in seasons to people that literally barely even eat or take whatever they take from these people that they're killing, and instead are opting to torture and kill people and traumatize people for some reason. This is a lot to think about and a lot to consider now when we're trying to figure out what these dudes got turned into, because now we know who they are, but what did they get turned into? It kind of just puts a red herring in what anybody would have thought any of these things were from the beginning, except for vampire and Wendigo theory, which now makes me reconsider all of the other mythology lore that I've been considering about this show. Because although a lot of it is very clearly still being referenced, the question now becomes, how important is any of that stuff? Because clearly we have a show now that's more focused on what they're trying to say and not what is being actually shown to us in this show, which I think is a detriment to this show. That does not mean that this show is good where it's at. I believe that we do need the mythology to make sense, and that if you're going to reference and take pieces of existing cultures and put them all into one show, you got to be very, very careful, because that could come off very freaking offensive. And we're starting to toe the line between a show that actually had really well thought out lore based off of time, based off of history, and based off of true mythology and cultures, and a show that just quite literally picked a bunch of different cultures to take from and put them all in one show. I hope I'm wrong. I'll probably end up making a separate video to show you guys all of these details that I've caught that are very clearly hinting at the fact that they have a million different references going on that are based off true history, true mythology, true cultures, true folklores, all of the above. But is it with the right intentions? And and I think that is what a lot of people are being, and I believe that's why a lot of people are so confused, because if it was done with the right intentions, it would be more obvious. And if it was done with the wrong intentions, people are confused because they're seeing their cultures in the show, but they're not seeing their culture actually be represented properly. So that's going to be a whole nother video for me. But that plot hole of what the monsters actually are, other than who they came from, is going to actually make or break this show, in my opinion. Now let's talk about reincarnation theory and the fact that we have now been confirmed that reincarnation is a part of From. I first want to start off by saying that my problem was not with reincarnation itself. Reincarnation as a concept that's been done in shows can be done well, although very rarely is done well. Reincarnation itself is not the problem. The problem is how it's being done in From. There's too many plot holes that don't make sense when you add reincarnation as a part of this story, instead of something that's easier to explain, like replacement and similar people. That was more of what was actually being set up by the plot of From. And without me harping too much on this, because it just simply is what it is, this is the route that they decided to go. There are just a lot of plot holes they're going to have to fix in order for the story in the end to make sense. And they got 2 seasons to do it. How are they going to fix explaining all of these other characters who are also very clearly replacements of someone else in a cycle? That the ages don't line up, the dialogue doesn't line up, the symptoms don't line up. All of these things need to be fixed. And fixing anything in a show post-production and post when it's already a part of the canon is so hard to do. And that's the only thing I'm concerned about. If reincarnation actually made sense with the original story that we were presented from season 1, including with the dialogue, the details, and everything else that's been in this show, I would be okay with reincarnation theory. I would think it's dope. I still think it's a good twist. It's a decent twist, and this is a good show. But it's caused me and a lot of other viewers to have to pivot and adjust the way that we see the show and the way we deem the show as being as good as we thought it was, and being as well thought out as we thought it was, being as detail oriented as we thought it was. And it simply is not that anymore based off of some of the answers we've got. I still love this show. I'm still going to make my theories on this show, but a lot of my theories now are not going to be based off of the details. It's not going to be based off of the history and the mythology anymore, most likely, because I'm starting to believe that all of those things are simply references and not what the show is actually built off of. We're in a cloudy situation right now where some things and some references that they've used can be deemed inappropriate and misused because the show is clearly not as detail oriented as we thought it was. And branching off of that, the last thing I wanted to mention is that basically any theory you have, whether it's Norse mythology, Native American mythology, I've seen some people bring up a bunch of other mythologies I was not familiar with as well on top of it, some Aztec, a lot of other things going on. The Doctrine of Abuse theory, the tarot card theory, All of these things are just simply things they drew from to create this show. That's why all of it is present at some point in the show. We see tarot cards in the show. We see them abuse thing in the actual show. We see Native American symbols in the actual show. We see Norse and Celtic symbols in the actual show. We see all of these things and events and buildings that are snapshots in time from all the dates that I mentioned in my landmark theory. Everything you're seeing in the show is not meant to be the answer to it all. It's not meant to be Dr. Mabuse is the man in yellow. It's not meant to be that it's all a tarot card game. It's not meant to be that everything in the show, the monsters and everything, can be explained by one mythology and one religion that already exists, historical folklore, none of that. All of it is being referenced in this show to create a completely new and unique story. So as I continue to do videos on this show, I'm going to bring that up to you guys, that it's less detail oriented than I thought. And the details are starting to not make sense together. And the references are getting looser and looser as we get more answers on this show. So if you see another theory on this show that's like, oh, this means this and this means this, just keep in mind that the details of this show, from the music and how it doesn't work to the monsters and how they don't really quite make sense to any one particular lore, how the dates are all kind of like mishmash together, even though they're very clearly in the show, how Dr. Mabuse is on the items and some of his lore is being used to create some of the monsters, but he is not the monster itself. How the tarot card theory and how some of the pairings and people in this town fit some descriptions of tarot cards. But again, it's not one-to-one. Something I've been hinting at for a while is all because none of it is supposed to actually explain what's going to be the ending of this show, what all the folklore means. And again, like I've mentioned in past videos, the drama holds weight. The drama makes sense. The drama is the other half of this plot in this show, of course. But the folklore at the end of the day should make sense in order for the show to be as great as it once was when we first watched it in season 1. So with that being said, I like the show. I like the answers we do have. I just wish that the show was more detail oriented than we've gotten in this last season. And maybe they still have room to fix that moving into seasons 4 and 5. We'll see. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be posting way more videos, some lighthearted videos, some great theory videos, because I still love this show. But I'm also going to give my opinion on what I feel like is happening in this show. I'm going to give my opinion on what's going on really with this show. And enough of you guys in my comments love the fact that I give my opinions and have those thoughts, and you share a lot of these feelings. So I'm not going to stop doing that. But I like this show. I love the finale. We got a lot of answers we were looking for, and we're going to have a lot more questions waiting for these other seasons of the show. So I appreciate everybody who's in this video. Like, subscribe if you're still here. Leave me a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.